Forever, Why Jamie Dimon is Wall Street's Indispensable Man. Nick Summers, thank you very much for talking to our viewers this morning. Appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
That does it for today's Washington Journal. Up next, live coverage of the House, a vote today on the Keystone XL pipeline. Thanks for watching.
The House will be in order. The Chair lays before the House a communication from the Speaker.
The Speaker's Rooms, Washington, D.C., May 22, 2013. I hereby appoint the Honorable Tom McClintock to act as Speaker pro tempore on this day. Signed, John A. Boehner, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Pursuant to the order of the House of January 3, 2013, the Chair will now recognize members from lists submitted by the majority and minority leaders for morning hour debate. The Chair will alternate recognition between the parties, with each party limited to 1 hour, and each member other than the majority and minority leaders and the minority whip limited to 5 minutes each. But in no event shall debate continue beyond 11:50 a.m. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe, for 5 minutes.
Please be seated.
Mr. Speaker, peace officers are the ones who diligently protect and serve the people. They are the first to respond to the call for help in time of trouble. They go after the bad guys and provide us safe communities to live in. Some take extra jobs to make ends meet. They wear the badge of commitment over their heart. Sheriff's departments in Texas wear a star over their heart. Today, peace officers in Houston, Texas have placed a black band across their badges in honor of one of the fallen among their number. Sergeant Dwayne Polk, 47, of the Harris County Sheriff's Department, was killed about 3 a.m. Sunday morning. He was headed home in his uniform after working a contract assignment. Sergeant Polk grew up in Houston, Texas, with his 3 sisters and his 2 brothers. His mother always encouraged him and the other kids to read the Bible. He had worked for the sheriff for 16 years. Sheriff Adrian Garcia said it was tough talking to his son, but he will have many big brothers in the Sheriff's Department. As Sergeant Polk was driving home that Sunday morning, his pickup truck was struck by Andres Muniz, who ran a red light, never slowed down, and crashed into Polk. Polk was killed. Muniz was drunk and had minor injuries. Muniz was charged with intoxication, manslaughter, and is in jail. He had been convicted last year for drunk driving and unlawfully carrying a pistol. He went to jail for 30 days for that offense. News reports also say Muniz was in the country illegally. Last weekend, while Polk was being killed in Texas, America's families of peace officers killed in the line of duty last year were here in D.C. Their fallen were honored by thousands of other officers from America on the west side of this Capitol. Next year, about this time, Sergeant Dwayne Polk of Harris County, Texas, and the Sheriff's Department will be remembered here as his name is read from the roll call of the dead. Citizens should appreciate the service of officers like Sergeant Polk. They do the work most of us would never do. They go into the worst places of our cities to root out evil that lives among us. They sacrifice for us. The least we can do is appreciate them for wearing the star or the badge over their heart, protecting the rest of us. They are the only thing that stands between us and the lawless. They are among the best we have. So we mourn for the loss of Sergeant Polk while thanking the good Lord such men as him ever lived. And that's just the way it is. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer, for 5 minutes.
Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, as the sequester's effects continue to place our economy and national security at risk, the news that 650,000 civilian defense workers will be forced to take unpaid leave ought to alarm all Americans who are concerned about our military readiness and national security. These furloughs will affect thousands who live in my district and thousands who live in the districts of every member here. After Congress voted earlier this month to end furloughs for air traffic controllers that had caused flight delays, one would have expected there to be a unanimous outcry for the rest of the sequester to be replaced. The best way to do that, of course, Mr. Speaker, is with a big and balanced agreement. But instead, Republicans in this House don't seem interested. It's not just Democrats who are taken aback by their silence. Republican Senator and former presidential nominee of the Republican Party, John McCain, said on May 14th, just a few days ago, about these furloughs for civilian defense employees, and I quote, "Nobody seems to care. It's amazing. It's one of the most amazing things I've seen in the years I've been in the Senate." So said John McCain. Democrats continue to call for the sequester to be replaced with a balanced approach to deficits that restores fiscal discipline, preserves our ability to pay for our military readiness, and invests in a strong economy. The sequester on its own is not a solution. It has been, however, Republican policy all along and is now in effect because they refuse to compromise in a bipartisan way to find a real solution. If you go back to July of 2011 and look at the Republican offer of the cut, cap, and balance bill, you will see that sequestration is in there. It is the alternative that Republicans put forth as policy. 229 Republicans voted for that policy. Well, they got what they wanted. On April 27th, a report in the Hill said, and I quote, "GOP leaders in the House said they have no plans to bring up broad legislation to replace sequestration," according to a leadership aide. The men and women who are hard at work supporting our troops and protecting our nation are set to be furloughed for 11 days this year. An unfair, unplanned, undeserved pay cut, while, frankly, the leadership of this House sits idly by and takes no action to replace the sequester. The same goes for the other terrible effects sequestration could have. 70,000 eligible children kicked off Head Start. 10,000 teachers' jobs at risk. Retirement disability claims delayed. 4 million fewer Meals on Wheels for seniors. 125,000 less rental assistance vouchers. 2,100 fewer food safety inspectors. Surely, if those were on the floor for a vote, most of us would not vote for them. But that's what's happening as a result of the sequester. We know, Mr. Speaker, what the Republican plan is for these defense cuts. To pass appropriation bills in the House that shift those cuts so that domestic programs, those education, Head Start, food safety that I've just mentioned, basic biomedical research, are cut more deeply than the parties agreed to in the Budget Control Act in 2011. We also understand, Mr. Speaker, and everyone recognizes that the domestic cuts Republicans want to impose instead couldn't even pass the House, let alone make it through the Senate or survive a certain veto. So again, Mr. Speaker, we have only one reasonable option before us, and that is to work together, to set our differences aside for the good of our country, and to achieve real compromise. A big, balanced, bipartisan approach that replaces the entire sequester is the only way to protect our defense workers against these furloughs and end the uncertainty that they and their families are facing. Let's have a vote, Mr. Speaker, on a balanced alternative. Not another vote to repeal health care reform that's not going anyplace. Not another vote to roll back the rights of workers. Not another vote to strip away safety standards or environmental protections. Let's stop wasting time and get to work on the most pressing challenge we face and make the tough choices necessary to restore fiscal stability and invest in our economy and in our national security. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Ask unanimous consent to revise and extend.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I'd find it irresponsible if I didn't mention it. Sounds like the light bulb has come on for my colleague from Maryland. He now says that we should replace the sequester. I only wish that that light bulb had come on when the House passed under Republican leadership twice in the 112th Congress to replace the sequester with responsible spending cuts. So it looks like here we are again. And you know, the recent admission by the IRS that it used its considerable authority and resources to target certain Americans because of their political affiliation should serve as an urgent warning to all Americans. The federal government is getting too large and has too much control. The simple truth is that when the government expands, personal liberty contracts. I found it both stunning and revealing when former advisor to President Obama, David Axelrod, said this, and I quote, "Part of being president is there's so much beneath you that you can't know because the government is so vast." For a member of this president's inner circle to admit that the federal government is so massive that it's essentially not practical for our chief executive to hold it accountable or for the president to effectively manage it is simply stunning. It also begs the question, if it is no longer possible for the President of the United States to oversee all the federal agencies assigned to him and to hold them accountable, then who is? Is anyone? As if the IRS scandal wasn't bad enough, there are other troubling stories that have arisen in the last few weeks. The Associated Press has said that the administration monitored hundreds of private phone calls between reporters. Is this really freedom of the press? Then we find that talking points given to the administration to tell the American people what happened on that fateful night in Benghazi were twisted, cut, turned, and edited to the point that the truth wound up on the cutting room floor of the White House, or the State Department, or the CIA, or the Department of Defense. Actually, we don't even really know, but we're going to find out. But we do know one very troubling thing. The federal government, with the IRS leading the way, is about to become exponentially larger and more powerful because it's about to get into the health care business. Obamacare will be fully implemented by next January. And according to the Treasury Department's Inspector General, the new health care law is the largest set of new tax law changes in 20 years. The IRS will be hiring more bureaucrats to make sure Americans comply with these new laws. And to oversee the flood of new personal information the federal government will be collecting on the American people. For example, under Obamacare, the federal government will require insurance companies to report to the IRS the name, the address, the identification number, and type of policy purchased by every customer. And if that weren't enough, the IRS will also require insurance companies to detail whether or not individuals purchased government-approved health care to ensure compliance with Obamacare's individual mandate. And just yesterday, Lois Lerner, head of the IRS's Exempt Organizations Division, announced that she would be invoking the Fifth Amendment to protect herself from self-incrimination. The truth is that our federal government is too big, too intrusive, and it's seeping into every aspect of our lives. It's taking away personal freedoms and collecting personal data. It has shown it can be manipulated to punish fellow Americans for their political beliefs, all at the expense of the American taxpayer. And let me be clear, I'm not a no-regulation guy. We need common sense regulations to ensure that our food is safe, our air and water are clean, our transportation system and infrastructure are sound, and that our financial transactions are secure, among other things. However, this administration has issued more than 10,000 regulations to date, including 106 major new regulations imposing $46 billion in additional costs that's being paid for by the American people. This means more rules, more bureaucrats, bigger government, and less freedom. Most troubling to me is that we were founded as a constitutional republic to be governed by the rule of law. But there are those in Washington who think we should be a nation governed by the law of rules, where the president and his bureaucratic agencies make up the rules. This represents a fundamental break from our history and traditions dating back to our founding fathers. Our founders placed their trust in the American people to elect their representatives to make the laws necessary to allow Americans to prosper. Mr. Speaker, I ask the American people to consider America's government's getting too big and too out of control. With that, I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Miller, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, in the wake of the horrific tragedy in Newtown, Connecticut, where 20 children were senselessly murdered, the issue of keeping children safe has been on the mind of all Americans. Since this tragedy occurred in schools, districts and states have understandably focused conversations on preventing and responding to violent crime that occurs in the school building itself. However, protecting children will require much more than preventing an outside intruder from committing acts of violence against students or a good emergency response plan to deal with the event. We need to recognize that violence or the fear of violence against children does not begin or end at the schoolhouse door. That's why I have devoted this month to introduce legislation that focuses on the safety needs of children as a national priority. First, I introduced legislation to establish minimum safety standards to prevent abusive, seclusion, and restraint practices in schools across the country. In Keeping All Students Safe Act would protect school children from inappropriate uses of seclusion and restraint, provide school personnel with the necessary tools, training, and support to ensure the safety of all students and school personnel. These practices are at best cruel and at worst deadly. They continue to be used on children across the country. In Indiana, an 8-year-old girl with Down syndrome had her shoes duct taped painfully to her ankles because she refused to put her shoes on. In North Carolina, a 14-year-old boy with traumatic brain injury was confined inside a cardboard box as a form of timeout. In some cases, children have died from improper restraints and seclusion. My bill also would stop these abusive practices, but safety shouldn't stop at the schoolhouse door. The investigations conducted by the Government Accountability Office at my request in 2007-2008 found that the private and public residential programs, including therapeutic boarding schools, wilderness camps, boot camps, and behavior modification facilities, are not always run in a safe manner. Recently in Tampa Bay Times confirmed the problems of abuse and neglect continue, with the stories of children being bruised, bloodied, and choked into unconsciousness at these programs, all in the name of discipline. More horrific stories of child abuse, including deaths in some cases, have been documented in 7 state residential programs in just the past 2 years. Last week, I introduced the Stop Child Abuse in Residential Programs for Teens Act, a bill that would set basic health and safety standards that states would need to adopt to enforce and protect teens from physical, mental, and sexual abuse in these programs. It would also create easily accessible information for parents about the safety record of the programs so that parents can make sound decisions about if they want to send their child there or not. No one disputes that our schools and residential programs must be a safe place for children where they can focus on learning and improving their lives, not on fearing for their lives. Though some states have made progress developing policies to protect children from acts of violence, abuse, and neglect, a patchwork of protections riddled with holes is not acceptable when it comes to our nation's children. We cannot sit idly by as incidents of children being abused or killed continues to occur. And today I'm introducing legislation that would prevent registered sex offenders and criminals convicted of crimes against children from working in schools. The Protecting Students from Sexual and Violent Predators Act would require public schools to conduct comprehensive background checks on any employee using state criminal or child abuse registries and the FBI's fingerprint database. It would also prohibit school districts from hiring or retaining anyone who has been convicted of certain violent crimes, including crimes against children, crimes involving rape or sexual assault, or child pornography. Mr. Speaker, keeping our children safe isn't a partisan issue. It's a moral obligation. This Congress must do more to protect our children. One way Congress can immediately help to ensure that students and schools have the support needed to address all aspects of violence is through the reauthorization of the Elementary Secondary Education Act. Through a bipartisan rewrite of the nation's education law, we can ensure that schools and students have the necessary support to provide key non-academic services essential to students to succeed in a safe and healthy learning environment. In the Elementary Secondary Education Act, Democrats will be fighting for these critical services, including other measures to promote safety, such as school services for violence prevention activities, bullying, harassment prevention, drug and alcohol abuse prevention, and programs to prepare for and to respond to natural disasters and emergencies in our school. Mr. Speaker, on my last point, my thoughts continue to be with the victims and families of all of those who have suffered and continue to suffer from the terrible tragedy that took place in Oklahoma earlier this week. And we are just amazed and honor all of the efforts of the school staff, teachers, and parents in trying to get children out of harm's way, and our hearts go out to those who were unsuccessful. I hope that Congress can support these communities in healing in every possible way. As always, keeping kids safe requires the coordinated efforts of children's principals, superintendents, community partners, and parents. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Dakota, Mr. Kramer, for 5 minutes.
Unanimous consent to revive consent.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, this week the House of Representatives is going to vote on a very important piece of legislation that should be unnecessary. Due to the President's objection at the insistence of Hollywood and the EPA, a critical piece of North America's energy security puzzle languishes on a desk in the Oval Office, while thousands of unemployed workers collect government benefits instead of a paycheck. That is why I co-sponsored and am doing all I can to pass H.R. 3, the Keystone Pipeline Northern Route Act, a bill that renders the northern route of the pipeline approved for construction, eliminating the need for a presidential permit. As vast reserves of oil are discovered and new technologies unlocked, energy security in this decade is well within our reach. The amount of oil that could be flowing to U.S. refineries on the Keystone XL represents nearly 50% of the oil that we currently import from the Middle East. Mr. Speaker, in addition to sitting on 2 of the subcommittees that held hearings on this legislation, I have a long history of involvement with TransCanada and the Keystone Pipeline as a former environmental regulator in North Dakota. From 2003 until my election to Congress last year, I carried the pipeline portfolio as one of 3 members of the North Dakota Public Service Commission. As you might imagine, oil and gas pipeline construction business is robust in my state, as the Bakken Shale development has elevated North Dakota to the position of the #2 producing state in the country. And one of the pipelines we cited while I was on the PSC was the original TransCanada Keystone Pipeline. It carries over 500,000 barrels of crude from the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin in Alberta to U.S. refineries in Illinois and Oklahoma. The first 217 miles of this pipeline actually run through our state. It crosses the border in Cavalier County, North Dakota, and runs through 7 more counties, crossing 600 landowners' land, 2 scenic rivers, and includes 5 pumping stations. While not universally loved, I can tell you that not a single inch of this line in North Dakota required condemnation proceedings, not because I was such a great regulator, but because I represent such great citizens. Our citizens understand the value of energy security and the jobs that energy development creates, and that same sentiment exists in our nation today. The environmental safeguards we demanded on the Keystone are rigorous and appropriate. They've been tested, and they work. I toured the Keystone during construction and met many of the men and women who are grateful for the good-paying jobs that built the line, and many other local restaurant and hotel proprietors, retailers, subcontractors who were happy to have the work and the business. The local officials and school administrators are grateful for the tax revenue that would not be there but for the Keystone Pipeline. And of course, the tax relief it provides local farmers, in addition to the easement payments, are a blessing. Mr. Speaker, I've cited hundreds, maybe thousands of miles of oil pipelines that operate safely and efficiently throughout North Dakota, but none as thoroughly vetted and safe as the Keystone XL. I've heard the arguments from my friends across the aisle who claim the Keystone only helps Canada and does nothing to the benefit of the United States. They also claim that carbon footprint is too great. The fact of the matter is the Keystone has already signed up over 60,000 barrels of North Dakota crude and has capacity for at least 100,000 barrels. Today, 71% of North Dakota crude is shipped by rail. Now, I have nothing against trains, but railing oil costs more and is not as safe as pipelines, and it requires trucks to get the oil to the train. According to the director of the North Dakota Department of Mineral Resources, Lynn Helms, approval of the Keystone XL will cause two things to happen. 300 to 500 truckloads per day will be taken off North Dakota highways, and there will be 1 to 2 fewer trains leaving the state. He calculates that greenhouse gas emissions from rail are 1.8 times and trucks 2.9 times greater than the emissions from pipeline transportation, and spills from truck transportation occur at 3 to 4 times the rate of spills from pipelines. Approval of the Keystone will result in 450 to 950,000 kilograms per day less in greenhouse gas emissions in North Dakota alone, as well as significant decreases in dust and 60 to 80 fewer spills per year. North Dakota officials also expect highway fatalities will be reduced by 3 to 6 per year and injury crashes by 85 to 150 annually if the Keystone XL is built. Mr. Speaker, America's national security and America's economic security are tied directly to America's energy security, and the Keystone XL pipeline is a critical weapon in that security, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today for the 12th time this year to talk about the need to end hunger now. I'm honored to serve on the House Agriculture Committee, and last week the committee held a markup on H.R. 1947, the Farm Bill. I believe we need a farm bill that contains smart, forward-thinking policy, a farm bill that ensures that farmers are able to make a living, a farm bill that benefits the American economy, a farm bill that ensures that the food grown in America makes it to the plates of every American, and a farm bill that isn't rife with fraud, waste, and abuse. The good news, Mr. Speaker, is that a component of that smart, forward-thinking policy already exists. It's called SNAP. This program ensures that 47 million people, out of the 50 million hungry in this country, are able to put at least some food on their tables when they otherwise couldn't do so. This program ensures that the food grown on our farms makes it to every American's table, not just the wealthy few. SNAP provides an economic catalyst because the SNAP benefit is spent in our local grocery stores and farmers markets, generating jobs and revenue. Indeed, every SNAP dollar results in $1.72 in economic activity, an amazing return on our investment. And SNAP has one of the lowest error rates of any federal program. But H.R. 1947 would undermine all of this. It cuts $20.5 billion from the program. That cut means that 2 million people would be kicked off of SNAP entirely. It means that 210,000 kids would be kicked off the free school meal program. It means that 850,000 people will see their SNAP benefits cut by $90 a month. And this is on top of a $25 a month cut for a family of 4 that will already take effect in November, no matter what happens to the Farm Bill. You know, there was a time not so long ago when solving the problem of hunger in America was a bipartisan priority. Former Senators George McGovern and Bob Dole worked tirelessly in the 1970s to make America hunger-free. Their partnership brought us to the point where we nearly eradicated hunger altogether. And I ask unanimous consent to insert at the end of my remarks an op-ed from yesterday's New York Times highlighting this bipartisan work.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, the problem today is that it's become far too fashionable in this House of Representatives to beat up on the poor. In fact, there is now a bipartisan effort to cut hunger programs. I'm sad to say that even some Democrats are willing to support this farm bill, even with these terrible SNAP cuts. Instead of moving forward together, we are moving backward. Mr. Speaker, the farm bill with these SNAP cuts is a bad piece of legislation. It's bad policy. It deserves to be defeated. Whatever good may be in this bill, from increased access to organic foods, to more humane treatment for animals, to increased job creation in agriculture, it is not an understatement to say that this bill will make hunger worse in America. For the life of me, I do not understand why we should be forced to choose between cutting access to food and providing jobs for our ailing economy. We can and we should achieve the joint mission of ending hunger now and creating jobs together. They are very much connected and should not be pitted against each other. But that's exactly what the Farm Bill would do, to the tune of $20.5 billion. We should end hunger now, not make hunger worse. We need a comprehensive effort to end hunger now. We need presidential leadership. We need a White House conference on food and nutrition. And we need a Congress determined to address hunger in America and bring it to an end, not make it worse. Hunger in America is a political condition, and nothing demonstrates that more than this Farm Bill. We have enough food to end hunger now. We just don't have the political will to do so. This effort to cut SNAP to make hunger worse must not stand. I hope my colleagues will join me in restoring these senseless cuts. And should that effort fail, I hope my colleagues will join me in defeating the Farm Bill when it is considered on the House floor. We can and we must do better. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Missouri, Mrs. Wagner, for 5 minutes.
Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 5 minutes revised and extend.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, again and again we have heard from this President and this administration that we need to embrace an all-of-the-above approach when it comes to meeting and supplying our country's energy needs. At the end of the day, that has simply turned into a none-of-the-above strategy, a failure by this administration. Mr. Speaker, this is not complicated. Approving construction of the Keystone XL pipeline is the first and easiest step that we can take in order to embrace our energy future immediately, to build jobs and to gain economic security. The application to build the Keystone XL pipeline has been gaining dust at the U.S. State Department for more than 4 years, awaiting approval, and each subsequent day that decision isn't made further denies this country greater energy security and the creation of over 500,000 jobs by 2035. By the State Department's own calculations, the number of potential jobs through construction alone stands at over 42,000. With the unemployment rate being above 7.5% for 4 of the years that the presidential permit has been pending, this just economically is irresponsible. With over 15,500 pages already produced in its National Environmental Policy Act review over the past 4.5 years, under the President's schedule, we must still wait yet another report and even more pages to determine whether construction of the pipeline would be in the, quote, national interest. At any moment, the President could step in and immediately order approval of the pipeline, yet he continues to sit idly by while more and more people, including a majority of the general public and even members of his own party, come out in support of the XL pipeline. Mr. Speaker, it is beyond reasonable doubt that creating thousands of jobs and providing American people more sources of oil by approving this infrastructure project that costs the American taxpayers no money is definitely in the national interest. So what are we waiting for? Today, the House of Representatives will take up H.R. 3, the Northern Route Approval Act, which will approve the Keystone XL construction application without a presidential permit, and let the American people know that we will not wait around any longer. At the end of the day, this crude will find its way to foreign markets one way or another, and construction of this pipeline will guarantee our access to it and help secure energy independence in North America. Today, the average price for a gallon of gas in America is around $3.60, which is nearly $2 more than when President Obama took his office. As the summer driving season approaches, that historically threatens to bring even higher gas prices for American families and businesses, ensuring that every environmentally safe source of oil is available in order to maintain an adequate domestic supply is absolutely vital. Because the President, yet again, refuses to act on an issue of such great importance for the nation, the Congress will lead by sending a clear message to the families of this great nation that we stand with you, we stand with jobs, and we stand for a more secure energy future here in America. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Costa, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, this weekend throughout America, in cemeteries across the land, we will celebrate and memorialize those men and women who have served, who are serving, and those who have made the ultimate sacrifice in giving their lives to protect our nation's freedoms embodied in our Constitution and our Bill of Rights that we hold most dear. And while Memorial Day is a time where family and friends gather to be together, we know it is much more than that. This Memorial Day, we should all give thanks to the sacrifices that our men and women have made who have served in our nation's military. We should say thanks to our family members, to our neighbors, to all those who have served, and we must always, always remember those who are no longer with us. We in our country, I believe, can never say thank you enough. For this great country we live in is made dear for all of those who have made those sacrifices over 238 years. So this weekend, as we gather across the land to be with our families and friends, let us pay thanks, let us take evidence of what it means to be an American, and knowing that at the end of the day, the bonds that we share in common as American citizens are much stronger than whatever differences we may have. God bless those who are serving and those that have served and those who are no longer with us. God bless our country. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. DeFazio, for 5 minutes.
Last month, two scientists from Oregon State University, Sean Marcotte and Alan Mix, published a peer-reviewed study in collaboration with scientists at Harvard reviewing 11,300 years of global temperatures. They found that the range of temperature change in the last 100 years is equivalent to the temperature change over the previous 100 centuries. Climate change is real. It's devastating, and it's accelerating. Now, most focus is on the terrestrial effects, but other research points to rapid and devastating changes in our oceans. Again, a study done by Oregon State University, Burke Hales, an OSU chemical oceanographer, co-author with Alan Barton, who works at the Whiskey Creek Shellfish Hatchery, looked into the fact that oysters were failing at an incredible rate to spawn and reproduce. And their study linked the production failures to the CO2 levels in the water. And that is, has incredible implications for the future of not only the shellfish industry, an important industry in the Northwest and other parts of the country, but also for the whole ocean food chain. The ocean chemistry is also threatening something called pteropods, who are tiny sea snails, and they're very much at risk. They happen to be a food source for zooplankton, whales, and of course our salmon, who already have a host of problems in terms of their future. And then from the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program, the Arctic seas are becoming rapidly more acidified. That turns out that cold water is especially susceptible, and as the sea ice in the summer recedes, more and more of the Arctic Ocean is exposed to the increased levels of carbon dioxide, and it's rapidly acidifying, in addition to which that the melting of the ice in Greenland and elsewhere is adding fresh water, which further degrades the capabilities of the oceans to deal with the carbon dioxide. And then finally, research in the Northeast shows that the surface temperatures in the Northeast continental shelf in 2012 were the highest recorded in 150 years of record keeping. They found that over the last 4 decades that many species of fish stocks are moving north to escape the warming waters, but there are many species that cannot move or evolve that rapidly, which portends for more disasters. Now, back in 1973, there was a science fiction movie called Soylent Green, sort of a mystery movie, but it was about an overpopulated and polluted world, and the final devastating blow was that the oceans were dying. And now we have evidence that our oceans are very, very much at risk from CO2 and climate change. Now, the House Republicans are using their leadership here to stymie efforts to even research and document climate change, let alone just totally denying that it's a problem. Time and time again, they voted to know nothing, do nothing about climate change. They voted to block action on climate change no less than 50 times in the last Congress. Mr. Speaker, it's time to listen to the scientists and get serious about climate change. The evidence is in. The only question now is whether Congress will listen and act. I yield back to Balfour.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from New Mexico, Ms. Lujan Grisham, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 5 minutes and to revise an agreement.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to talk about jobs. Now, I've served almost 5 months in the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, and I've heard a lot of my colleagues talk about jobs, but we've had little opportunity to actually vote on legislation that would create American jobs. Just this week, the Albuquerque Journal reported on the unbelievable difficulty that many New Mexicans are having finding a job. The headline says it all. According to the article, when the Downs Racetrack and Casino in Albuquerque held a job fair last week to fill 400 openings, 6,400 job seekers showed up. One young man interviewed said, "I put in 60 applications in the year I've been unemployed and haven't had a single call back." Another job seeker noted, "This is the first time in my life, in 49 years, I've been without a job. You read about it, you think about it, and then when it happens, it's a real awakening." But instead of creating an environment that would foster economic growth, Congress has done the exact opposite by allowing the indiscriminate across-the-board budget cuts known as sequestration to take effect. According to the director of the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, sequestration could result in the loss of 750,000 American jobs this year alone. If there is one state that cannot afford to lose any more jobs, it's New Mexico. Our state's economy has been barely crawling along since the Great Recession of 2008. Last week, however, we finally got some good news. New Mexico's Department of Workforce Solutions reported that our state's employment growth in April was the best it's been in 5 years. A Department of Workforce Solutions official said, in fact, the economic recovery in New Mexico may be gathering momentum as we start sustained recovery. Now, just as New Mexico finally appears to be on the way to economic recovery our families and businesses so desperately need, the sequester threatens all of this progress. And this week, New Mexico's got some really bad news. The Department of Defense announced plans Tuesday to furlough about 680,000 of its civilian employees, including 7,000 New Mexicans, for 11 days through the end of this fiscal year. Now, some might think that 11 days doesn't sound like much, but let's take a closer look at what 11 days without pay means to individual families. When furlough notices begin going out at the end of this month, 7,000 hard-working New Mexicans will find out that they will be losing about 20% of their salary for the rest of the fiscal year. Now, these families are trying to pay their mortgages, make their car payments, and put their kids through college. Families are already living paycheck to paycheck and struggling just to get by. Can you imagine what losing 20% of a paycheck means to them? It's devastating. Although New Mexicans may feel the worst of consequences of the sequester this year, sequester is not just a one-year problem. It will negatively impact our nation's economy for the next
9 fiscal years. Now, we all agree we need to reduce our long-term deficit, but we need a balanced approach that will create jobs. On May 14th, the CBO released new projections. The deficit will fall by an extra $200 billion this year than previously expected. The CBO now forecasts that the deficit will shrink to 2.1% of the GDP by 2015 from a high of 10% of GDP in 2009. The International Monetary Fund has called the pace of deficit reduction overly strong, arguing that Washington should focus on job creation in the short term and develop a long-term strategy for future deficit reduction. The IMF added that this year's $85 billion in sequester-mandated cuts will negatively impact growth this year and beyond. It's true that you can't tax your way to prosperity, but you can't cut your way to prosperity either. And draconian, across-the-board budget cuts aren't going to create jobs. I agree with those who say we need to get our fiscal house in order. But to do that, we first need to solve the unemployment problem that is plaguing small towns and big cities throughout the nation. More than half of the deficit stems from a sluggish economy and an unemployment rate that is above 7%. Mr. Speaker, we need more Americans to get back to work. We need more Americans to get back to work so that less Americans will need to rely on social safety net programs in order to survive. We need more Americans to get back to work so that they'll have more money to spend on goods and services, which will create even more jobs. It has become clear that the House Republicans' so-called plan to create jobs was just empty rhetoric, a hollow promise to the American people. If House Republicans were serious about creating jobs, they would vote on the updated Van Hollen substitute, a real plan to replace the sequester with a sensible, balanced approach to deficit reductions that puts jobs creation first. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentlelady's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Bishop, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to recognize the passing of Almerindo Al Carvalera, a Vietnam veteran who lived an extraordinary life of service to his country and to his fellow veterans. Al succumbed to cancer on January 21, 2013 at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northport, New York. Al was born on October 21, 1947 in Portugal. His family emigrated to the United States when he was 10 years old and settled in Wisconsin, New York. Al proudly served his country in the United States Army during the Vietnam War and received numerous awards and decorations, including 2 Purple Hearts, the Bronze Star Medal, and the Air Medal. Honorably discharged with the rank of sergeant in December of 1969, Al returned to his home on Long Island, where he pursued a career in nursing and was hired by the Northport VA Medical Center in 1977. There, he dedicated himself to the care and treatment of his fellow veterans as a VA registered nurse and nurse leader for nearly 4 decades. Al was known as a highly effective and empathetic caregiver who was never too busy to spend time with his patients, especially the most challenging among them. His own experience gave him a unique understanding of what his patients had endured in combat. In discussions with them, he often cited his favorite book, The Things They Carry, written by fellow Vietnam veteran Tim O'Brien. Soon after his start of his career at the VA Medical Center, Al was promoted to nurse manager, which gave him supervision of all inpatient psychiatric units and the outpatient treatment program. In addition to these significant responsibilities, Al trained and developed staff in crisis intervention and implemented a crisis response team for the safety of VA patients and staff. In order to provide veterans the best care possible, Al found the time to earn a master's degree in nursing from Stony Brook University. Dear to Al's heart was the Suffolk County, New York chapter of the Vietnam Veterans of America, to which he devoted 38 years of service, working day in and day out, taking care of his boys, advocating for the needs of all veterans, and raising awareness of the contributions and sacrifices made by our nation's veterans and their families. In May of 2009, I had the great pleasure of working with Al and his friends and fellow Vietnam veterans, Richie Kitson and Clarence Simpson, to rename the Riverhead, New York Post Office in honor of Suffolk County's only Vietnam War Congressional Medal of Honor recipient, PFC Garfield M. Langhorne. That same year, Al took the lead in the construction and dedication of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Garden on the grounds of the Northport VA Medical Center, which recognizes and honors the sacrifices of our nation's servicemen and women. The Memorial Gardens dedication ceremony was held in October 2010 and attended by more than 300 people. In 2011, Al and members of the VVA were inspired by Dignity Memorial's replica of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall to expand the Northport VA Medical Center's Vietnam Veterans Memorial Garden for the inclusion of a permanent war memorial known as the Wall of Wars. It was during this time that Al was diagnosed with cancer. Although Al will not be present at the VA's Veterans Day dedication of the Wall of Wars, his legacy as a war hero, a VA nurse, and a veterans advocate is and will be forever present on the grounds of the Northport VA Medical Center and throughout Suffolk County's veterans community. On January 25, 2013, Vietnam veteran and U.S. Army Sergeant Al Cavalera was laid to rest with military honors at Long Island's Calverton National Cemetery. Al is survived by his beloved wife of 40 years, Geraldine, and their 2 sons, Almerindo and John, as well as 6 grandchildren. Mr. Speaker, on behalf of New York's 1st Congressional District and a grateful nation, it is my honor and privilege to recognize Almerindo Al Cavalera for his distinguished service and many contributions to our nation and his fellow veterans. He will always be remembered with our love and appreciation. I yield back the balance of our time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Recently, research has shown that fish populations are not waiting for climate change to make their habitat impossible for them to live. They're moving. That's right. Fish all over the globe are migrating to cooler climates. In a process that's been taking place for decades now, fish are sorting themselves out and leaving areas that no longer sustain their quality of life, their ability to reproduce and to thrive. They've steadily been moving to areas where the effects of climate change are not so pronounced. Isn't it interesting that fish, without fancy scientific instrumentation or computer analysis, have reacted to the facts in the sea and moved to where they can function, where they can live, and where they can, at least for the time being, escape the impacts of climate change. They're also escaping from people who depend on them in their previous habitat to fish. But that's another story on the consequences of climate change and global warming. Isn't it time that the political process starts responding in ways that even fish can? One would hope. But instead, today, on the floor of the House, we're going to return to debate the Keystone Pipeline that would carry oil extracted from Canada's tar sands to the U.S. Gulf and short-circuit the presidential review. Given the potential negative environmental impacts, the repeated efforts by some to rush the environmental and public safety review process, the overwhelming number of comments and concerns received from the public, and the recent news about the atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide that have reached 400 parts per million, an amount not seen in at least 3 million years, I'm concerned that this sideshow over the Keystone Pipeline will make our climate problem worse rather than better and poison the ability to make progress in the future. The simple fact is that this pipeline would facilitate the exploitation of one of the dirtiest sources of energy, tar sands oil, that poses public safety and health risks. In addition to possible worsening of the effects of global climate change, there are serious questions that remain about pipeline safety, spill prevention, and protecting the public from potential health impacts in the wake of the spills that are inevitable. Tar sand developers are amazingly exempt from paying into the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund, making American taxpayers liable for the cost of any spills from the Canadian tar sands oil. This places, I think, an unacceptable and unnecessary risk on American taxpayers, one that we can ill afford to assume today. Now, this will be the 7th time that we voted and that I will vote against proposals to streamline the building of the Keystone Pipeline, as some members of the House continually, repeatedly attempt to circumvent the legislative process and rush its proposal. The only positive of this project is creating several thousand temporary construction jobs and a few dozen permanent. That's no reason to short-circuit the review required by law. The potential environmental harm done by the pipeline, both from the threat of oil spills to the precious aquifer that it will be passing over, and because tar sands emit 3 times more global warming pollution than conventional oil, has led me to the conclusion that I hope President Obama does not approve the pipeline. There are many things we should be doing to rebuild and renew America and create millions of jobs, not a few thousand temporary construction jobs. We ought to be looking at different approaches to revenue and dealing with carbon pollution. For instance, we are discussing a draft that would potentially tax carbon emissions, dealing directly with the problem, help provide revenues to lower taxes and pay for what America needs, and to deal with emerging technologies and level the playing field for technologies of the future. Now, as we watch climate change begin to have serious impacts on our environment, our fish, our wildlife population, and our seasons, and the weather, the least we can do is to take actions that may well make climate change worse.
The gentleman's time has expired. If no other member seeks recognition, pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess until noon today.
Members are taking a break now before starting legislative work at noon Eastern. 3 bills on the agenda, including one to allow construction of the northern portion of the Keystone XL pipeline. More Live House coverage here on C-SPAN when they return. And a reminder that the 2013 Congressional Directory is now available. It's a handy guide to the current Congress with updated listings for each member of the House and Senate, contact information,